Part 1. The World's Most Polite Maritime Disaster. Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, sink deep into the cushions, and let the frantic energy of the day just drift away. We're going to take a very long, very slow, and arguably very damp walk through one of the weirdest diplomatic standoffs in modern history. We're talking about a time when two NATO allies, Britain and Iceland, spent nearly 30 years threatening each other over a very specific, very grumpy-looking fish. This is the story of the Cod Wars, a series of conflicts where the primary weapons were oversized scissors and a relentless sense of Nordic stubbornness. So, get comfortable, adjust your blankets, and let's float back to a time when the fate of empires rested on the availability of fish and chips. Now, to understand why two civilized nations almost came to blows over a bottom dweller, we have to understand Iceland in the mid-20th century. Iceland is effectively a very large volcanic rock in the middle of the North Atlantic. It's beautiful, it's moody, and back then it had exactly one thing going for it: fish. Cod, specifically. To the Icelanders, cod wasn't just dinner, it was the entire economy. It was their gold, their oil, and their national identity. If the cod disappeared, the island basically became a very pretty, very cold parking lot. On the other side of the water, you had the British. Now, the British have a deep spiritual connection to fried fish. By the 1950s, British industrial trawlers were roaming the North Atlantic like hungry wolves, pulling up massive amounts of cod from the waters just off the Icelandic coast. The Icelanders watched this from their shores and decided that if they didn't do something soon, they'd be left with nothing but empty nets and volcanic ash. So in 1958, Iceland did something very bold and, according to the British, very rude. They declared that their territorial waters reached 12 miles out from their coast, instead of the traditional 4 miles. They essentially told the British, you can fish, but you have to stay way over there. The British, of course, responded with the international diplomatic version of a shrug. They sent their trawlers in anyway, and because they were feeling extra spicy, they sent the Royal Navy along to protect them. This was the first Cod War. It wasn't exactly master and commander. It was more like a very slow-motion game of chicken. The Icelandic Coast Guard consisted of a handful of converted tugboats with small guns, while the Royal Navy showed up with actual frigates. But the Icelanders had a secret weapon. They were much, much more annoying than the British expected. They didn't try to sink the British ships. Instead, they would sail their tiny boats right up to the massive trawlers and try to cut their fishing nets. They used these giant specialized net cutters, basically massive underwater head shears, to snip the expensive cables. The British trawlermen would watch in horror as thousands of pounds worth of equipment and fish sank into the abyss, while a tiny Icelandic boat sped away into the fog like a mischievous sea sprite. The British were furious, but they were also in a bit of a bind. You can't exactly open fire on a tiny boat from a friendly nation just because they ruined your afternoon. It would look bad in the papers. So, for months, the Royal Navy and the Icelandic Coast Guard just bumped into each other. Literally. They engaged in shouldering, which is the maritime equivalent of trying to push someone out of a line at the grocery store. Huge steel ships would lean into each other, grinding metal against metal, while everyone on board tried to look very stern and patriotic. Eventually, the British realized that protecting every single fishing boat costed more than the fish were actually worth. In 1961, they reached a deal. Iceland got their 12 miles, and Britain got to keep their dignity, or at least the bruised version of it. Everyone went home, the fish kept swimming, and the world moved on. Except, of course, it didn't, because why stop at 12 miles when you can have 50? In 1972, Iceland decided the 12-mile limit was a bit too cramped. They announced they were extending their zone to 50 miles. This was the second Cod War, and this time the Icelanders were prepared. They had better net cutters, faster boats, and an even higher tolerance for international awkwardness. They also realized they had a massive trump card: the Cold War. Iceland told NATO, and specifically the United States, that if the British didn't stop bullying them over fish, they might just close the Keflavik air base. This was a nightmare scenario for the West. Keflavik was the primary listening post for Soviet submarines. If Iceland kicked the Americans out, the North Atlantic would basically become a private swimming pool for the USSR. Suddenly, the fish fight became a matter of global security. The British were told by their allies to play nice, but the British fishing industry was having none of it. They wanted their cod, and they wanted it now. So the Royal Navy went back in, the net cutters came back out, and the maritime shouldering escalated into full-blown rammings. Ships were getting massive holes punched in their hulls, sailors were being sprayed with high-pressure fire hoses, and the diplomatic cables were melting. The most ironic part of this whole disaster was that while the two nations were bickering over who got to catch the cod were starting to disappear anyway. Overfishing was doing more damage than any net cutter ever could. But when you're in the middle of a nationalistic grudge match over a fish, logic is usually the first thing to get tossed overboard. As we leave the gray, freezing waters of the 1970s and the sound of grinding steel, just feel the weight of the Atlantic fog. The ships are battered, the diplomats are exhausted, and the cod are just down there in the dark, wondering what all the fuss is about.
So, the British had been thoroughly annoyed by the first two rounds of this watery chess match, and the Icelanders had realized that their net cutters were essentially the most effective diplomatic tool since the invention of the pen. But as we've seen with every historical bubble or royal obsession, humans have a hard time knowing when to call it a day. In 1720, it was paper stocks. In 1975, it was once again the humble cod. This was the third Cod War, the finale of the trilogy, and by far the most dramatic, despite still being, fundamentally, a fight over who got to provide the filling for a Friday night supper. By 1775, Iceland decided that 50 miles simply wasn't enough legroom. They announced a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. To the British trawler captains in places like Hull and Grimsby, this was an existential threat. If they couldn't fish within 200 miles of Iceland, their entire way of life was going to evaporate. So the British government, feeling the pressure of a disgruntled public and a sinking fishing industry, sent the Royal Navy back in with a level of seriousness that suggested they were hunting for a rogue submarine rather than protecting a few guys with nets. This time, the net cutting became a high art form. The Icelandic Coast Guard vessels like the Tyr and the Odin were manned by crews who treated net cutting like an Olympic sport. They developed even more sophisticated scissors, heavy V-shaped steel blades on long cables that they would drag across the path of the British trawlers. A single successful pass could cost a British crew thousands of pounds and days of work. The British responded by sending specialized tugboats to act as shields. These were basically floating bumper cars, heavy, reinforced ships designed to put themselves between the Icelandic cutters and the British trawlers. The result was a series of maritime collisions that were less accidental bump and more high-speed car crash. Between 1975 and 1976, there were over 55 recorded ramming incidents. These weren't just scrapes. We're talking about massive steel hulls being torn open, bows being crushed, and sailors on both sides being thrown across the decks. Because why just fish when you can engage in a demolition derby in the middle of a Force 8 gale? The humor of the situation, if you can find humor in cold, wet sailors trying not to drown, was the sheer disparity in the fleets. The Royal Navy was one of the most powerful forces on the planet, equipped with frigates designed to fight the Soviet Union. The Icelandic Coast Guard was a handful of ships that looked like they belonged in a harbor, not a theater of war. Yet the Icelanders were winning. Why? Because they had nothing to lose, and they had the geography. The British public began to see the images on the nightly news, giant British warships seemingly bullying tiny Icelandic boats. It was a PR disaster for London. And then the Icelanders played their final, most devastating card. They officially broke off diplomatic relations with the United Kingdom. This was the first time two NATO allies had ever done this. They threatened, once again, to shut down the Keflavik airbase. In Washington, the Pentagon went into a full-blown panic. The fish war was now threatening to blow a hole in the Cold War defense of the West. If the British didn't back down, the Americans might lose their eyes and ears in the North Atlantic. The pressure on London from the United States became unbearable. The message was clear: we love your fish and chips, but we need that airbase more. In June 1976, Britain finally blinked. They signed a treaty that essentially gave Iceland everything they wanted. The 200-mile limit was recognized, the British trawlers were forced to retreat, and the fishing ports of northern England, towns that had been built on cod for centuries, fell into a long, slow economic decline. It was a total victory for the tiny island nation over the former ruler of the waves. The legacy of the Cod Wars wasn't just a change in the price of fish, it actually helped create the modern law of the sea. The 200-mile exclusive economic zone that Iceland fought for is now the international standard for every coastal nation on Earth. Iceland hadn't just protected their dinner, they had rewritten the rules of the oceans. As we leave the now quiet waters of the North Atlantic and the rusting hulls of the old trawlers, just feel the chill of the sea breeze fade. The net cutters have been retired to museums, the rammings have stopped, the cod are still there in the deep, cold dark, unaware that they once almost started World War III.
Part 3. The Romanov Nursery. Velvet, Snow, and the Shadow of the Healer. So, we've watched the British fishing fleet retreat into the fog, defeated not by cannons, but by the sheer, unyielding stubbornness of a tiny island and a very strategic airbase. It's a strange comfort, really, to know that even the most powerful navies can be humbled by a few well-placed pairs of underwater scissors. But as we flow away from the salt spray of the Atlantic, we're heading east, deep into the heart of a vast, winter-locked empire that was about to find out that its own internal fragility was far more dangerous than any foreign fleet. We're going to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to look at the Romanov children, the sad, sickly, and spoiled heirs of the Russian Empire. To understand the Romanov children, you have to understand the atmosphere they were born into. It was a world of absolute, suffocating luxury, but it was a luxury wrapped in a thick, heavy layer of anxiety. Their father, Tsar Nicholas II, was a man who preferred a quiet family dinner to the business of ruling an empire. And their mother, Alexandra, was a woman whose deep, mystical piety was often indistinguishable from a total nervous breakdown. They had 4 daughters first: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. They were known collectively as OTMA, a name they formed from their initials. They were beautiful, they were spirited, and they were, by the standards of the day, incredibly isolated. They lived in a sort of gilded bubble at the Alexander Palace, far away from the simmering resentment of the Russian people. They slept on hard camp beds, took cold baths, and spent their days studying, knitting, and playing in the snow, all while being guarded by soldiers who were increasingly wondering why they were protecting people who lived in a fairy tale while the rest of the country was starving. But the real drama of the Romanov nursery revolved around the youngest, the long-awaited son and heir, Alexei. Born in 1904, Alexei was the sunbeam of the family. He was a bright, handsome boy, but he carried a secret that would eventually bring down a 300-year-old dynasty. He had hemophilia, the royal disease passed down through his grandmother, Queen Victoria. For Alexei, a simple bruise wasn't just a bump, it was a potential death sentence. An internal bleed could keep him in agony for weeks, his joints swelling until he couldn't move, his face turning as pale as the Russian snow. The Tsar and Serena were desperate. They kept his illness a state secret, which meant they couldn't explain why the heir to the throne was suddenly disappearing for months or being carried everywhere by a giant sailor. Because why just have a normal childhood when you can have one where a sneeze might cause a national crisis? This desperation led the Tsarina directly into the arms of Grigory Rasputin. Now, history has painted Rasputin as a sort of hyper-powered wizard monk, but to the Romanovs, he was simply the friend. He was a Siberian peasant with unwashed hair and piercing blue eyes, who seemed to have the uncanny ability to stop Alexei's bleeding simply by talking to him or praying over him. Modern doctors think he might have just calmed the boy down, lowering his blood pressure, but to Alexandra, it was a miracle. The presence of this holy man in the palace was the ultimate PR disaster. Rumors swirled through St. Petersburg that Rasputin was running the government, that he was the Tsarina's lover, that he was a dark sorcerer. The more the public hated him, the more the Tsarina clung to him, convinced that her son's life depended on this one peasant. It was a loop of isolation and paranoia that completely severed the Romanovs from the reality of their country. The children, for their part, adored him. They wrote him sweet, innocent letters, and he told them stories of the Siberian wilderness. They lived in a world of incense, prayers, and velvet, while outside the palace gates, the 20th century was arriving with a loud, violent bang. World War I broke out, and the Romanovs' isolation turned from a quirk into a tragedy. When the revolution finally came in 1917, the children were almost confused. They had been kept so sheltered that they didn't understand why the soldiers who used to salute them were now spitting on their shadows. They were moved from palace to palace, their world shrinking until it was just a few rooms in a house in Yekaterinburg, the house of special purpose. Even in captivity, they tried to maintain their little world. They put on plays, they studied their French, and they tended to their sick brother. They were teenagers who had been taught they were semi-divine, now washing their own clothes in a bucket. There is a profound, quiet sadness in those final photos of the Romanov children. Shaved heads for measles, thin faces, but still possessing that strange, distant royal calm. As we leave the cold, quiet cellar of the Apatiev house and the echoes of a lost empire, just feel the stillness of the Russian night. The velvet is gone. The sunbeam has faded. The prayers of the friend could not save the throne. So, we've watched the Romanov children drift from the golden halls of the Winter Palace into the cold, gray silence of a Siberian basement, a dynasty undone by a secret in the blood. But while the Romanovs were the victims of a random mutation, there was another family that spent centuries meticulously crafting their own biological disaster. We're floating away from the Russian snow now, heading south and west across the heart of Europe to the sun-baked, granite-heavy silence of the Escorial in Spain. We're going to talk about the Habsburgs, the family that decided that if the crown was to stay in the family, the DNA had to stay there too. The Habsburgs were the masters of the royal loop. They looked at the map of Europe and decided that the best way to keep their titles and their gold was to marry their cousins, their nieces, and their uncles. For nearly 200 years, the Spanish branch of the family treated their family tree like a straight line. It was a strategy designed for power, but nature has a way of charging interest on those kinds of debts. And in 1661, that debt finally walked into the world in the form of Charles II of Spain. Charles was the final tragic result of centuries of genetic recycling. To give you an idea of the math, a normal person has 32 unique ancestors in their fifth generation. Charles II had only 10. His inbreeding coefficient was actually higher than that of a child born to two biological siblings. He was quite literally a man built from a broken blueprint. The most visible sign of this was the Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism. It wasn't just a prominent chin, it was an architectural catastrophe. Charles's lower jaw jutted out so far that his teeth didn't meet. He couldn't chew his food properly, and his tongue was so oversized that he drooled constantly and could barely be understood when he spoke. He was a king who was essentially a prisoner of his own face. But the problems weren't just on the surface. Charles didn't walk until he was 8. He was never educated because the court was simply relieved if he survived the night. He lived in the Escorial, that vast, grim monastery palace that Philip II had built to look like a grill, the symbol of the martyred St. Lawrence. It was a place of endless, muffled prayers and the heavy scent of incense. Charles spent his days surrounded by priests and exorcists because the Spanish court couldn't accept that their king was the victim of bad biology. They insisted he must be the victim of a curse. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. They performed endless, terrifying rituals to unbewitch him. They brought in the relics of saints, they whispered incantations over his bed, and they even forced him to sleep in a room with the exhumed corpses of his ancestors, hoping their royal presence would somehow heal him. Charles, for his part, was a gentle, melancholy soul who mostly just wanted to be left alone to play with his toys or watch the shadows move across the granite walls. The tragedy reached its peak when it came to this succession. Because Charles was the last male Habsburg of the Spanish line, the entire fate of an empire that stretched from the Americas to the Philippines rested on him producing an heir. He was married twice, once to a French princess who reportedly wept when she first saw him, and later to a German princess who spent her days being frustrated by his lack of, well, everything. The pressure was suffocating. Every time the queen had a stomachache, the bells of Madrid would ring in desperate hope. But Charles was sterile, another gift from his ancestors. He knew it, the doctors knew it, but the political theater had to continue. He spent his final years watching the ambassadors of Europe circle his throne like vultures, carving up his empire while he was still breathing. When Charles finally passed away in 1700 at the age of 38, his autopsy was a document of pure Gothic horror. The physician noted that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his head was full of water, and he appeared to have been a man who had been used up by history before he was even born. He was the end of a line that had simply run out of road. As we leave the cold, silent rooms of the Escorial and the heavy, jutting shadows of the Habsburgs, just feel the weight of that dynastic pride. The gold of the Americas couldn't buy a healthy heart. The crown of the Holy Roman Empire couldn't fix a broken jaw. The line has snapped, and the empire is moving into the hands of a new family, the Bourbons, who would bring their own unique brand of dysfunction to the table. The night is still. The ghosts of the inbred kings have finally stopped whispering. Everything is quiet.
Subscribe if you love this kind of immersive historical storytelling. It's not just facts, it's feelings. Drop your current city and time in the comments. I love knowing who's sailing the night seas with me.